The sun rose over the town of Hamelin on the morning of June 26, 1284, just as it had every morning before. But by nightfall, 130 children would be gone, vanished so completely that no trace of them would ever be found. Not a body, not a scrap of clothing, not a single witness who could explain where they went or what became of them. Imagine the moment when the first mother realized her child had not come home. Perhaps she stood in the doorway of her medieval dwelling, scanning the cobblestone street as the light began to fade, telling herself that her son or daughter was simply playing too long with friends. Then the second parent began to worry, and the third, and soon the entire town was gripped by a terror so profound that it would echo through 7 centuries. The children were not hiding. They were not lost in the surrounding forest. They had simply ceased to exist within the boundaries of the known world. What followed was not the gradual fading of a folk tale or the distortion of legend through countless retellings. Instead, the people of Hamelin did something extraordinary. They documented their loss. They carved it into wood. They inscribed it onto the walls of their church. They created a stained glass window that depicted the exact moment of disappearance. A window that would stand for nearly 400 years until its destruction in 1660, but not before its details had been carefully recorded by those who saw it. The window showed the children leaving, their small figures following someone or something out of the town gates, their parents watching helplessly from behind. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a story embellished over generations until truth and fiction became indistinguishable. The town records of Hamelin mark this date with the same solemnity that other towns recorded plagues, fires, or invasions. For over 700 years, the people of this German town have commemorated an absence, a void in their history where 130 young lives should have been but never were. The medieval town fell into an eerie silence after that day. The sounds that once filled the streets, the laughter of children at play, the calls of boys running errands, the songs of girls drawing water from wells, all of it stopped. Parents walked through empty rooms, touching toys that would never be played with again, laying out meals for children who would never return to eat them. The entire social fabric of the community had been torn apart in a single afternoon. Who took them? Where did they go? These questions have haunted investigators, historians, and folklorists for generations. The theories are numerous, and each one more disturbing than the last. Some point to evidence of mass abduction, perhaps by slave traders or military recruiters who saw an opportunity in a vulnerable medieval town. Others have uncovered hints of religious movements, cults that swept through Europe in that era, promising salvation but delivering something far darker. There are those who believe the children were lured into joining the Children's Crusade, doomed expeditions that ended in death or slavery in distant lands. Still, others have found records suggesting plague, famine, or forced migration, though none of these explanations account for why only the children disappeared, why no bodies were ever recovered, why the town would record the event with such specific detail if it were merely a natural disaster. And then there are the truly unsettling theories, the ones that speak of things we cannot easily categorize or explain, forces that operate outside our understanding of how the world works. What we will explore together in this investigation is not a simple mystery with a neat solution. We will walk through medieval streets, examine church records written in fading ink, trace the path those children might have taken on that summer day. We will look at evidence that points in multiple directions, testimonies that contradict each other, facts that refuse to align into a coherent narrative. Some of what we uncover will suggest rational explanation. Some of it will lead us into darker territories where reason struggles to follow. The stained glass window that once stood in Hamelin's Church of St. Nicholas was destroyed during renovations centuries ago, but descriptions of it survived. It showed a figure in multicolored clothing, leading a stream of children through the town gates. Behind them, the tiny figures of parents reached out in desperation, but they did not follow. Why did the parents not pursue? What prevented them from chasing after their own children as they walked away? This detail alone suggests something deeply wrong about that day, something that paralyzed the adults even as they watched their children disappear. The story has never faded from Hamelin's collective memory. The town still maintains a Bungelissenstrasse, a street where no music may be played, marking the path the children allegedly took. Even now, in the 21st century, this prohibition is observed. The absence of those children remains a living presence in the town, a wound that has never healed, a question that demands an answer even though 7 centuries have passed. As we move forward, we will examine each theory with the scrutiny it deserves. We will look at what the medieval records actually say, what the folklore has added, and where the line between the two has become impossibly blurred. We will consider what drives human beings to take children, what would motivate an entire group of young people to abandon their homes, and what could cause a town to mark such an event with obsessive precision for hundreds of years. The answers we find may not comfort us. In fact, the most compelling evidence may be the most disturbing. But the children of Hamelin deserve to have their story told, their disappearance examined, their fate explored with every tool of historical investigation we possess. Something happened on that June day in 1284. Something terrible and inexplicable. And somewhere in the fragments of record and legend that survive, the truth is waiting to be uncovered. In the town archives of Hamelin, Germany, there exists a Latin inscription that was once carved into the stained glass window of the market church. The words, transcribed before the window was destroyed during renovations in the 1600s, read with chilling precision, "In the year of our Lord 1284, on the day of John and Paul, the 26th of June, a piper clothed in many colors led 130 children born in Hamelin to Calvary near the Koppen, where they were lost." This is not folklore embellishment. This is not a fairy tale opening. This is an official church record, documented in Latin, the language of law and religion, placed in one of the most sacred spaces in medieval society. When the church wanted to record births, deaths, and marriages, they used Latin. When they wanted to document a catastrophe so profound that future generations must never forget, they used Latin. And they placed it where the faithful would see it every time they came to pray. The inscription's existence raises questions that historians have struggled with for centuries. Why would a prosperous medieval town immortalize a children's story in sacred stone and glass? Why would civic authorities commit resources to preserving what should be merely a legend? The answer becomes unavoidable when you examine how Hamelin itself responded to the events of 1284. This was not a tale they told. This was a wound they documented. The town chronicles of Hamelin reveal something extraordinary about collective trauma. For decades after 1284, the town dated its official records using a unique system. Instead of simply marking years since the birth of Christ, as was standard practice throughout medieval Europe, Hamelin scribes wrote their documents as years after our children left. 10 years after our children left. 10 years after our children left. 20 years after our children left. 30 years after our children left. Imagine the psychological weight of that decision. Every contract signed, every deed transferred, every official act of governance carried with it a reminder of loss. This was not accidental. This was deliberate memorialization embedded into the bureaucratic fabric of daily life. The town could not function without acknowledging what had been taken from them. Consider what this means from a historical perspective. Medieval towns were practical entities. Record-keeping existed for taxation, property rights, legal disputes, doubt. The dating system was a tool, not a memorial. Yet, Hamelin chose to transform every mundane administrative act into an act of remembrance. When a merchant sold grain, the transaction was recorded in the context of vanished children. When property changed hands, the deed was witnessed by the absence of an entire generation. This is evidence of trauma so profound that it became inseparable from civic identity. The street itself testifies to something catastrophic. Bungelissenstrasse, the street of the drumless, or the street without drums, runs through the heart of Old Hamelin. According to both written records and oral tradition, this was the last place the children were seen before they followed the piper out of town. A ban on music and dancing on this street appears in town ordinances going back to the medieval period. Even today, modern Hamelin observes this prohibition. Wedding processions do not play music as they cross Bungelissenstrasse. Street musicians avoid it. The ban has no legal enforcement in the 21st century, but residents honor it anyway. For more than 700 years, this street has been marked as sacred ground, a place where joy is inappropriate, where celebration would be obscene. Think about the social mechanisms required to maintain such a tradition across centuries. Hamelin has survived plagues, wars, occupations, regime changes, the complete transformation of medieval society into the modern world. Yet, through all of this, through all the generations that had no living memory of 1284, the town continued to honor a ban on music along one specific street. This is not how folklore behaves. Folklore shifts, adapts, fades. This is how collective memory of real trauma behaves. This is how communities mark the sites of disasters they cannot allow themselves to forget. When the Brothers Grimm arrived in the early 1800s to collect German folk tales, they approached Hamelin differently than other locations. Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were not merely storytellers or entertainers. They were scholars, linguists, researchers attempting to preserve German cultural heritage through systematic documentation. They collected hundreds of tales, most of which they openly acknowledged as fantasy, as peasant wisdom, as moral instruction wrapped in magical thinking. But their treatment of the Pied Piper stands apart. In their notes and correspondence, the Grimm brothers expressed something unusual: discomfort with the historical authenticity of what they had found. The Grimms discovered that Hamelin possessed not legends, but records. They found the Latin inscription transcribed in multiple sources. They examined the town chronicles with their peculiar dating system. They walked Bungelissenstrasse and noted its prohibition. They spoke with town officials who showed them documents, not fairy tales. The brothers included the story in their collection, but their annotations reveal their recognition that this was fundamentally different from Cinderella or Snow White. This was documented history that had acquired folkloric embellishment over time, not folklore that had acquired a false veneer of history. Their investigation uncovered details that troubled them. The specificity of the date, the 26th of June, the feast day of Saints John and Paul. The precision of the number, 130 children. Medieval chroniclers rounded numbers, exaggerated for effect, used symbolic figures. But Hamelin's records maintained consistency across multiple independent sources. This suggested not storytelling, but testimony. Not legend, but documentation of an actual event so traumatic that the community felt compelled to record it with unusual precision. What catastrophe could explain this response? Theories have proliferated over the centuries. Some historians suggest a children's crusade, that young people were recruited or lured away to fight in distant wars from which they never return. Others point to dancing plague, to mass psychogenic illness, to outbreaks of disease that specifically targeted the young. Some propose emigration, that economic hardship forced families to send their children away as colonists to Eastern Europe, and that the pain of this separation created the legend. Each theory attempts to rationalize the irrational, to explain why an entire generation of children would vanish from a prosperous town in a single day. But the theories themselves miss what makes Hamelin extraordinary. Regardless of what actually happened, the town's response reveals the depth of the wound. If children died of plague, medieval towns buried them and moved on. Death was common. If young people left for crusades or colonization, families grieved individually, but towns did not restructure their calendar systems. Something about the events of 1284 was different enough, shocking enough, complete enough, that normal mechanisms of grief proved inadequate. Modern Hamelin has not forgotten. The town maintains multiple museums dedicated to the event. The Pied Piper House, built in 1602, features a carved facade depicting the piper and children, with an inscription reminding visitors of what was lost. The Museum Hamelin includes permanent exhibitions examining the historical evidence and exploring the various theories. These are not tourist attractions exploiting a famous fairy tale. These are acts of institutional memory, the town continuing its 700-year commitment to documentation. Plaques throughout the old town mark significant locations in the story. The Pied Piper statue stands near the old market square. Bronze rats embedded in the pavement create a trail for tourists to follow, but the trail deliberately stops at Bungelissenstrasse, where the children were last seen. The town has commercialized its dark history, yes, selling Piper merchandise and hosting themed festivals, but beneath the commercialization runs something deeper. The insistence that this matters, that this must not be forgotten, that every generation bears responsibility for remembering. Every Sunday from mid-May to mid-September, the town stages a musical performance in the Old Town Square. Actors in period costume reenact the story while thousands watch. This is not Disney entertainment. This is ritual, a community gathering to witness the representation of its founding trauma. The performance ends with the children following the piper away, vanishing through the streets, and the town is left empty. The audience does not cheer. This is commemorative theater, closer to a passion play than a fairy tale production. The persistence of Hamelin's memory reveals something profound about collective trauma and historical consciousness. Most medieval disasters have faded into footnotes. Towns that suffered plagues, fires, invasions, famines left minimal records. Life was hard, death was common, and communities moved forward. But Hamelin could not move forward. Whatever happened on the 26th of June, 1284, created a rupture so complete that the town's identity became inseparable from loss. They were the town that lost its children. They are still the town that lost its children. 7 centuries have not closed that wound. This is what makes the documented evidence so disturbing. We want folklore to be fantasy, legend to be legend. We want clear boundaries between history and myth. But Hamelin refuses those boundaries. The Latin inscription, the chronicle dating system, the street ban, the Grimm brothers' discomfort, the modern commemorations, all of it points to something real, something that happened, something catastrophic enough to echo across centuries. The rats, the magical pipe, the mountain that opened. These may be embellishments added by traumatized minds trying to make sense of the senseless. But the children, the date, the street, the grief, these appear to be historical fact. What happened in Hamelin? We may never know with certainty, but we know that something happened, something the town could never reconcile, never forget, never move beyond. And in their obsessive documentation, in their determination to ensure that every future generation would know what was lost, the people of Hamelin created something unique in medieval history. A collective memory so powerful that it transcended folklore and became historical identity itself. The children of 1284 are still missing. The town is still counting the years since they left, and Bungelissenstrasse remains silent. Every child knows the story. A mysterious stranger in colorful clothes appears in the town of Hamelin, promising to rid the community of a terrible rat infestation. When the ungrateful townspeople refuse to pay him, he takes his revenge by leading their children away, never to be seen again. It's a tale of broken promises and terrible consequences, a cautionary story that has echoed through nurseries and schoolrooms for generations. But what if almost everything you know about the Pied Piper is a lie? What if the rats, the colorful costume, even the musical pipe itself were embellishments added centuries later, layers of comforting fiction meant to obscure a darker historical truth? The story we think we know comes primarily from the Brothers Grimm, who published their version in the early 1800s. Their tale, with its whimsical piper and plague of rats, became the definitive version, the one that spread across the world. But when scholars trace the story backward through time, something remarkable happens. The further back they go, the simpler and stranger the tale becomes. The colorful details fall away like paint peeling from an old wall, revealing something far more disturbing underneath. The earliest written reference to the Pied Piper appears in a stained glass window that once stood in the market church of Hamelin, created around 1300. The window was destroyed in 1660, but multiple sources described what it depicted before it vanished. According to these accounts, the window showed a figure in colorful clothing leading children away, with an inscription that read, "In the year of our Lord 1284, on the day of Saints John and Paul, the 26th of June, 130 children, born in Hamelin, were led out of the town by a piper clothed in many colors. After passing the Calvary near the Koppenberg, they disappeared forever." Notice what's missing from this earliest account. There are no rats, no mention of a plague or infestation, no explanation for why the piper came or why he took the children. Just the stark, horrifying fact. On a specific date, 130 children vanished from the town of Hamelin, led away by a mysterious figure. The rats don't appear in the story until much later. The first known connection between the piper and rats doesn't emerge until 1559, in a chronicle written by Count Froben Christoph von Zimmern. That's nearly 300 years after the event supposedly took place. Other writers in the 1600s began including the rat element more regularly, and by the time the Brothers Grimm collected their version, the rats had become central to the tale. They weren't just an addition. They were the entire reason for the story's existence. Think about what the rats accomplish narratively. They provide a motive, a clear cause and effect. The town has a problem. They hire someone to solve it. They break their promise, and punishment follows. It transforms a mysterious and inexplicable tragedy into a moral tale about keeping your word. The rats make the story make sense. They give it structure, logic, a satisfying narrative arc. But in doing so, they may have buried the truth of what actually happened in Hamelin in the summer of 1284. Folklorists call this process mythologization, the way communities transform traumatic historical events into stories they can live with. Dr. Wolfgang Meter, a leading expert on the Pied Piper legend, has spent decades studying how the tale evolved. According to his research, communities rarely preserve traumatic memories in their raw form. Instead, they reshape them, adding explanatory elements that make the trauma comprehensible. The rats serve exactly this function. They transform an incomprehensible loss into a tale with clear villains, the greedy townspeople who refuse to pay, and a clear lesson: keep your promises. But if the rats were added later, what really happened? And who was the piper? The colorful clothing mentioned in even the earliest accounts is significant. In medieval Germany, bright, multicolored garments weren't common. Most people wore simple, undyed wool in browns and grays. Colorful clothing indicated wealth, status, or a specific profession. Some historians believe the piper's distinctive dress might have marked him as a recruiter of some kind. Medieval Germany saw waves of what was called the Ostsiedlung, the Eastern Settlement Movement, where recruiters traveled through towns, convincing or coercing people to migrate east and settle newly conquered territories. These recruiters were known for their persuasive abilities and sometimes their colorful, eye-catching appearance designed to draw crowds. The German word used in some early accounts is Rattenfänger, which we translate as rat catcher. But the term has deeper implications. Fänger means catcher or captor, someone who seizes or entraps. Before the rats were added to the story, could Rattenfänger have meant something else entirely? Some scholars suggest it might have been a code word, a way of speaking about something too painful or dangerous to name directly. In medieval German slang, variations of this term were sometimes used to describe kidnappers, slavers, or recruiters who used deception. Then there's the pipe itself. Music was deeply symbolic in medieval culture. A pipe or flute was associated with enchantment, with leading people astray, with the supernatural. In medieval art, the devil was sometimes depicted with a pipe. So was death. When early accounts describe the piper's music, they use words that suggest supernatural compulsion. The children didn't choose to follow. They couldn't help themselves. They were, in the language of the time, bewitched or enchanted. Wow. This leads to one of the most unsettling theories about the Pied Piper. What if the piper wasn't a person at all? What if he was a metaphor, a way of personifying something the medieval mind couldn't otherwise explain or accept? Some historians have suggested the piper might represent death itself, perhaps referring to a plague or epidemic that struck only the young people of Hamelin. Others propose he might symbolize a recruiter for the children's crusade, though the timing doesn't quite align. Still, others believe he represents a mass kidnapping or abduction, the children taken as slaves or forced colonists. The most disturbing aspect of these theories is what they suggest about medieval life. If the piper was a metaphor, it means the people of Hamelin experienced something so traumatic, so incomprehensible, that they could only speak of it in symbolic terms. They created a figure, colorful and strange, to embody whatever force had stolen their children. Over time, this figure became more elaborate, more fantastical, until the traumatic core of the story was completely wrapped in layers of folklore. Dr. Maria Tatar, a folklore expert at Harvard University, explains that fairy tales often serve as vessels for historical trauma. Communities don't create these stories to preserve accurate historical records. They create them to make unbearable realities bearable. The addition of the rats is a perfect example. With the rats, Parents in Hamelin could tell their children a story that had logic and fairness. Bad things happen when people break promises. The universe operates according to rules. Without the rats, all that's left is the terrifying randomness of children disappearing. The universe operating according to no rules at all. Consider how the story's tone shifted as the embellishments accumulated. The earliest accounts are brief and mournful, recording a terrible loss without explanation. As the centuries passed and details were added, the story became more elaborate, more entertaining, more suitable for children. The piper became almost comical in some versions, a trickster figure, sometimes foolish, sometimes clever. The children's fate became ambiguous. In some tellings, they were sealed in a cave. In others, they emerged in Transylvania. In still others, they simply vanished into a magical realm. These softer endings make the story easier to tell, easier to hear, easier to survive. But Hamelin never forgot the core of the story. Even today, the town maintains the Bungelosenstrasse, a street where, according to local tradition, music and dancing are forbidden because that's where the children were last seen. The town records continue to date events as so many years after the children left. This isn't the behavior of a community preserving a charming fairy tale. This is the behavior of a community that experienced genuine tragedy. The transformation of the Pied Piper from historical horror to children's story reveals something profound about how humans process collective trauma. We can't live with raw grief forever. We need meaning, structure, explanations. So we add them. We create villains and heroes. We build moral framework. We turn tragedy into teaching moments. Each generation adds another layer, another embellishment, until the original event is buried so deep that it takes archaeological scholarship to uncover it. The rats are the most successful embellishment in this process because they're so effective. They answer the question every child asks: why did the piper take the children? Because the townspeople didn't pay him. Why didn't they pay him? Because they were greedy and dishonest. The rats transform an inexplicable horror into a cautionary tale about integrity and fairness. They make the universe comprehensible again. They make it safe. But safety comes at a cost. Every comforting detail we add to the story takes us further from what might have actually happened. The real children of Hamelin, the 130 who disappeared on that June day in 1284, are lost twice over. First in whatever tragedy befell them, and second in the layers of folklore that buried their true story under colorful clothes and magical pipes and conveniently explanatory rat. Modern Hamelin struggles with this duality. The town profits from tourism built on the fairy tale version, complete with piper statues and rat-themed souvenirs. But it also maintains its historical records, its forbidden street, its careful dating system. The town seems to understand, even if it can't quite articulate, that beneath the charming story lies something real and terrible and unresolved. When we tell the Pied Piper story to children today, we're perpetuating the final stage of this mythologization process. We're passing on the version where everything makes sense, where justice operates, where there are clear lessons to be learned. We're not telling them about the stained glass window, the missing children, the community that experienced something so devastating they could only speak of it in metaphors and symbols. We're certainly not telling them that the rats, the most famous part of the story, were invented centuries later to make an unbearable truth bearable. The Pied Piper reminds us that history and folklore are not the same thing, though they're often confused. History is what happened. Folklore is how we learn to live with what happened. And sometimes the folklore is so much more appealing, so much more comfortable, that we forget to look for the history underneath. We forget to ask what truth the story might be hiding, what pain it might be soothing, what questions it might be designed to prevent us from asking. The children of Hamelin deserve better than rats. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of 13th century Europe as a boy no older than 12 stood in the town square, listening to words that would change his life forever. A preacher, dressed in simple robes but radiating an almost magnetic confidence, spoke of Jerusalem. He spoke of divine visions, of angels descending with messages meant only for the pure of heart, for those unburdened by the sins of adulthood. He spoke of children who would succeed where armored knights had failed, whose innocence would part the Mediterranean Sea itself, allowing them to walk dry-shod to the Holy Land. And across the continent, in town after town, children listened. They believed. And they left everything behind to follow. This was not fantasy. This was documented history. And it might explain what really happened to the children of Hamelin. In the year 1212, a French shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes claimed to have received a letter from Christ himself. The message was clear and intoxicating in its simplicity. Children, through their purity alone, would reclaim Jerusalem without violence, without bloodshed, without the brutal machinery of war that had characterized the adult Crusades. Stephen was perhaps 12 or 13 years old, yet he spoke with the authority of prophets. He gathered followers first in the countryside around his village, then in larger towns, and finally, thousands converged on the roads leading south toward the Mediterranean coast. Contemporary chroniclers recorded the movement with a mixture of awe and horror. Monks writing in monastery scriptoriums described rivers of children flowing along the roads of France, singing hymns, carrying crosses fashioned from sticks and rope. Some accounts suggest as many as 30,000 children joined this procession. 30,000 sons and daughters who simply walked away from their families, from their trades, from their futures. What happened to them reveals the darkest possibilities for Hamelin. Most of the French children never saw Jerusalem. They reached the port city of Marseille, where their faith promised the seas would part. The waters did not divide. Instead, according to the chronicles, 2 merchants offered to transport the children across the Mediterranean in their ships, asking no payment beyond the satisfaction of aiding a holy cause. The children, still believing in divine providence, boarded 7 vessels. 2 ships sank in a storm near the island of San Pietro, drowning everyone aboard. The remaining 5 ships did not sail to the Holy Land. They sailed to Bougie in Alexandria, slave markets in North Africa, where the merchants sold every child into slavery. The merchants, it later emerged, had planned this transaction from the beginning. In Germany, a similar movement arose almost simultaneously. A boy named Nicholas gathered thousands of children in Cologne, promising the same miraculous journey. This procession headed south through the Alps toward Italy. The mountain crossing alone killed hundreds. Medieval chronicles speak of small bodies found years later by shepherds, perfectly preserved in ice, still clutching wooden crosses. Those who survived the mountains reached the Italian ports of Genoa and Pisa, where they scattered. Some begged for passage across the sea. Others became servants, apprentices, or simply disappeared into the anonymous masses of medieval cities. A few eventually made it home, broken and aged beyond their years. The historical record confirms these movements occurred. The debate among scholars centers on how many were truly children and how many were simply young, poor, desperate people seeking any escape from the grinding poverty and violence of 13th century life. But multiple sources confirm that significant numbers were indeed children under the age of 15, and that religious fervor drove them forward. Now, consider the Hamelin event. The most commonly cited date for the disappearance is June 26, 1284, though some sources suggest it occurred as early as 1284 or as late as 1284. This places it roughly 70 years after the main children's crusade movements, but religious mania did not end in 1212. Throughout the 13th century, waves of crusading fervor swept Europe. Preachers wandered from town to town, calling for holy war, promising salvation, exploiting the deep and genuine faith that permeated medieval society. The timeline correlation becomes more interesting when we examine the broader pattern. Historians have documented numerous smaller-scale movements throughout the century, inspired by charismatic preachers who promised divine intervention in exchange for faith. These were not always formally organized crusades. Sometimes they were pilgrimages, processions of flagellants seeking to appease an angry god during times of plague or famine, or simply groups convinced that abandoning their sinful homes would lead to paradise. What if such a preacher came to Hamelin? Imagine the scene. A small town in Lower Saxony, isolated by distance from the major centers of power and culture. A community struggling with whatever challenges define their existence, whether plague, economic hardship, or simply the grinding difficulty of medieval survival. Into this setting walks a stranger. He speaks beautifully. He promises escape, transformation, salvation. And most importantly, he targets the children. Why children? The psychological manipulation at work here reveals a sophisticated understanding of human vulnerability. Dr. Helena Marsh, a historian specializing in medieval religious movements at Cambridge University, explains that preachers deliberately sought young converts because children possessed a dangerous combination of imagination and faith. They could envision the miraculous more easily than adults. They were less cynical, less bound by practical considerations. They believed that seas could part, that cities would open their gates without siege, that innocence itself was a form of invincibility. Moreover, children were susceptible to peer influence in ways that adults were not. When one child in a community declared intention to join a crusade or pilgrimage, others followed not from individual conviction, but from the powerful force of social conformity. Medieval chronicles describe this phenomenon repeatedly. A few children becoming enraptured, then dozens, then hundreds, creating a cascade effect that overwhelmed parental authority and community cohesion. The techniques used by these preachers were remarkably consistent across different movements. They began with private visions, claiming direct communication with Christ, the Virgin Mary, or various saints. This established their authority as beyond earthly challenge. They then created urgency. The mission must begin now. Delay would displease God. The window of divine favor was closing. They promised specific, tangible miracles. The sea will part on this date. The walls will fall when we sing. Our enemies will convert at the sight of our faith. And crucially, they separated children from their families emotionally before the physical departure, suggesting that parents who objected were testing the children's faith or were themselves contaminated by sin and doubt. Professor Michael Thornton, who studies medieval psychology at the University of Edinburgh, notes that these preachers understood something fundamental about human cognition. They created what modern psychology would call a total narrative, a complete worldview that explained everything and demanded everything. Children who accepted this narrative found themselves in a mental framework where leaving home was not abandonment, but obedience, where marching toward unknown dangers was not foolishness, but courage, where ignoring their parents' desperate pleas was not cruelty, but faithfulness. The Hamelin story, in its earliest written forms, describes the children following willingly. The piper plays, and they walk after him, enchanted but not bound. They are not dragged or carried. They choose to follow, which is somehow more disturbing than any account of kidnapping or violence. This detail aligns perfectly with the children's crusade pattern. Those children also walked willingly. Their parents chased after them on the roads, weeping, begging them to return. The children kept walking. One chronicle from the French movement describes a mother who followed her son for 3 days, calling his name, promising forgiveness, offering anything if he would just come home. The boy never looked back. He marched with his eyes fixed forward, singing hymns with the other children. On the 4th day, the mother gave up and returned to her village. She never saw him again. This is the chilling possibility that the crusade theory presents for Hamelin. Not that someone stole the children, but that someone convinced them to leave. Not that they were victims of violence, but that they were victims of manipulation so complete that they participated in their own doom with joy and conviction. The question that haunts this theory is simple. Where did they think they were going? If a preacher came to Hamelin promising a crusade or pilgrimage, the children must have believed they were marching towards something wonderful. Jerusalem, perhaps, or a holy site closer to home. Maybe they were promised that God would provide for them along the way, that their faith would sustain them, that they would become living saints whose names would be remembered forever. Instead, if this theory holds, they likely met the same fates as the documented crusade children. Some may have died on the roads, succumbing to exposure, starvation, or disease. Others might have been sold into slavery when their promised miracles failed to materialize. Perhaps some ended up scattered across Europe, losing their way home, forgetting even their own names as years passed. A few might have eventually returned, but by then the trauma and shame of recognizing their mistake could have kept them silent, explaining why no one came back to tell the tale. The most disturbing evidence for this theory comes not from what we know, but from what went unrecorded. The 13th century saw countless small movements of believers, flagellants, child preachers, and wandering prophets. Most left no trace in the historical record beyond brief mentions in local chronicles or monastery ledgers. Hamelin was a minor town. If a preacher convinced the children to leave, and if those children disappeared into the chaos of medieval Europe, why would this event have been documented beyond a simple note in the town's own records? The fact that any memory survived at all suggests the trauma was profound, but the details were lost almost immediately, leaving only the image of children walking away and never returning. And this raises the final, most haunting question. If the children walked willingly, enchanted by promises of divine glory, believing until the very end that their suffering had meaning, does that make their fate better or worse than if they had been simply stolen in the night? They trusted. They believed. They had faith. And that faith led them into darkness. What if the children of Hamelin never vanished at all? What if they simply walked away toward a new life, following promises that glittered like gold but crumbled like ash in their hands? The traditional tale speaks of supernatural abduction, of revenge and magic. But tucked within medieval records lies another possibility, one rooted not in fantasy, but in the brutal economics of the 13th century. This theory suggests the children were actually young adults, teenagers and young men and women in their late teens and early 20s, recruited for something very real and very dangerous: the Ostsiedlung, the great German eastward colonization that reshaped medieval Europe. During the 12th and 13th centuries, vast territories stretched eastward from the Holy Roman Empire, lands perceived as wild and underpopulated. Transylvania, Moravia, Silesia, Poland and regions beyond beckoned to European lords who needed bodies to farm the soil, build the towns, and hold the frontier. These weren't empty lands waiting to be claimed. They were contested territories, forests thick with danger, swamps breeding disease, and populations who didn't necessarily welcome German settlers with open arms. Yet the promise of land ownership, something impossible for common folk back home, proved irresistible. The recruitment system was sophisticated and well organized. Professional agents called locators traveled through German towns and villages, authorized by Eastern lords to gather colonists. These recruiters dressed distinctively, often in bright, eye-catching clothing that announced their presence from a distance. Contemporary accounts mention recruiters in colorful garments, sometimes specifically in pied or multicolored cloth, that would stand out in a crowd of drab peasant browns and grays. They were walking advertisements, designed to attract attention and inspire dreams of transformation. The locators' pitch was practiced and persuasive. They promised land grants, tax exemptions for the first years of settlement, the right to German law rather than feudal obligations, freedom from serfdom. For young people in overcrowded towns like Hamelin, where guild restrictions limited opportunities and primogeniture meant younger sons inherited nothing, these promises sounded like salvation. The locators specifically targeted the young, those old enough to work but not yet fully established in their home communities. Medieval records show that colonization efforts deliberately recruited people between 15 and 25 years old, those with strength for hard labor, but fewer ties binding them to home. Now consider Hamelin in 1284 Torre. A prosperous market town, yes, but one groaning with too many mouths and too few opportunities. The rat infestation mentioned in later versions of the tale might metaphorically represent this overcrowding, this sense of resources stretched too thin. When a locator arrived, perhaps dressed in that memorable pied clothing, offering a solution to restless youth, the town elders might have quietly encouraged the recruitment. Parents might have reluctantly agreed, seeing no future for their children at home. The departure would have been public, organized, and probably involved some ceremony. Migration wasn't a shameful thing in this context. It was an adventure, a chance at advancement. Imagine 130 children, which medieval counting often meant anyone unmarried and under their parents' roof, gathering in the market square. They would carry their few possessions, perhaps some tools, seed grain, a family heirloom or two. The locator would lead them east, following established routes toward their promised land. And here's where the theory gains remarkable support: the names. Researchers examining settlement records in Transylvania, Moravia, and Poland have discovered something extraordinary. Hamelin family names appear in founding documents of towns established in the late 13th and early 14th century. Names that were common in Hamelin show up in distant eastern settlements, particularly in clusters that suggest group migration. Places like Hermannstadt in Transylvania, founded with German colonists, contain records of surnames matching Hamelin registers. Other Transylvanian villages show similar patterns. The town of Hamelin in Pomerania, far to the east, was founded during this exact period. Some researchers believe this might be a daughter settlement named by colonists from the original Hamelin. The linguistic variations are telling. Hamelin becomes Hamelin, morphing as it travels eastward. Several villages in Moravia contain founding charters listing German settlers with surnames traceable to the Hamelin region, documented in the decades following 1284. This isn't coincidental. It suggests that people from Hamelin did indeed travel east and did establish themselves in new communities. The children, or young adults, didn't vanish into a mountain or drown in a river. They walked hundreds of miles to new lives, carrying their family names with them, planting them in foreign soil, where those names still exist today. But if this relocation happened, if it was legitimate and organized, why did it become a tragedy? Why does the story drip with loss and mourning? Why do the chronicles describe it as a catastrophe rather than a successful emigration? The answer likely lies in what happened during and after the journey. Medieval migration was extraordinarily dangerous. The routes east crossed through forests where bandits hunted for exactly these vulnerable groups. Rivers had to be forded without bridges. Disease thrived in close traveling conditions. Records from other colonization efforts show mortality rates of 20 to 40% during the journey alone. Young, inexperienced travelers without adequate supplies or protection would have suffered terribly. Consider also the reception awaiting them. The Promised Land grants often turned out to be deep in contested territory. Slovak and Romanian populations in Transylvania didn't always welcome German settlers who arrived with charters claiming their traditional lands. Violence between settlers and existing populations was common. The tax-free years the locators promised assumed the settlers would survive long enough to establish productive farms. Many didn't. Contemporary accounts of early settlement years in eastern territories describe starvation, failed harvests in unfamiliar soil, raids by hostile neighbors, and diseases unknown in western Germany. Some settlements failed completely within the first year. Others limped along for a few years before being abandoned or absorbed. The young people from Hamelin might have found themselves trapped in a nightmare, far worse than anything they'd left behind, with no resources to return home. And this brings us to the silence, the absence that transformed migration into myth. Why didn't the children send word back home? Why didn't they write letters or send messengers to reassure their families? First, understand that literacy was limited. Few peasants or craftspeople could write. Sending a letter required finding a literate scribe, paying them, and trusting the message to travelers heading west. This was expensive and uncertain. Second, if the settlement was struggling or failing, the young colonists might have felt shame. They'd left home with such hopes, such promises. To admit failure, to confess they'd been deceived, would have been humiliating. Pride keeps many migrants silent even today. Third, and darkest, many might have died before they could establish communication. If the mortality rate was high in the first year, as it often was, survivors would be scrambling simply to stay alive. Writing home becomes impossible when you're fighting starvation or disease. And if the settlement failed catastrophically, if most or all of the Hamelin group perished, there would be no one left to tell the tale. Some scholars suggest another possibility: deliberate suppression of communication. If the recruitment had been partially fraudulent, if the locator had made promises he knew were false or exaggerated, he would have every reason to prevent colonists from warning others. Some settlement contracts actually forbade colonists from leaving or sending discouraging news back home during the first years. This was framed as preventing defeatism, but it also protected the recruitment pipeline. The parents and families left in Hamelin would have waited. Weeks became months. Months became years. No letters arrived. No messenger brought news. In an age when silence almost always meant death, the families would have begun mourning. The town would have held memorials. The children became, for all practical purposes, dead. This explains why the story took on such tragic dimensions. The migration might have been real, but the outcome was devastating enough to scar the town's collective memory. Whether the young people died during the journey, perished in the harsh conditions of the settlement, or simply became lost to all communication, the effect on Hamelin was the same. A generation gone, never to return. The false promises of the locator, his bright pied clothing and golden words, would have become symbols of betrayal. In the retelling, he transformed into something supernatural, a magical piper whose enchantment explained the incomprehensible loss. It's psychologically easier to blame magic than to confront the brutal economics that convince parents to send their children to danger. This theory of colonization as the true story behind the Pied Piper accounts for the historical core while explaining the tragedy. It grounds the tale in documented medieval practices while preserving the genuine grief that gave birth to the legend. The children walked out of Hamelin toward a new life that destroyed them, following false promises dressed in colorful cloth, becoming casualties of an economic system that treated young lives as resources to be exploited on distant frontiers. The winter of 1284 came to Hamelin with an unusual silence. Church records from that year, preserved in the Lower Saxony archives, show something peculiar. The baptism entries continue as expected through spring and summer. The marriage records appear normal, but the burial records tell a different story. In the second half of that year, there is a gap, an absence so conspicuous that historians have spent centuries trying to explain it away. What if the Pied Piper was never a man at all? What if the figure in the colorful coat, the musician leading children away, was simply how a traumatized community chose to remember something far more terrible? What if the Piper was death itself, and the children never left Hamelin because they were already buried just outside its walls? Medieval Europe knew death intimately. Plague swept through communities with horrifying regularity, and children died with such frequency that some historians estimate nearly half of all children born in the 1300s failed to reach their 10th birthday. Towns developed elaborate rituals and stories to cope with this constant grief. They created narratives that gave meaning to meaningless loss. They transformed unbearable tragedy into tales that could be told, retold, and eventually survive. The theory of mass epidemic explains several troubling aspects of the Hamelin mystery that other interpretations cannot. It accounts for why so many children would disappear simultaneously. It explains why no ransom was ever demanded, why no bodies were found along any road, why no neighboring town reported an influx of strange children. Most tellingly, it explains why the exact number of children lost varies so wildly in different accounts. Some sources claim 30 children vanished. Others say 130. The earliest accounts do not specify a number at all, referring only to many children. This imprecision matches how medieval communities recorded epidemic deaths, especially when the loss was too overwhelming to count accurately. Archaeological investigations near Hamelin have sought to test this theory. In 1998, a team from Göttingen University conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys in fields northeast of the Old Town walls, in an area called the Koppenberg. Medieval towns typically buried plague victims outside consecrated ground, away from the town proper, to prevent further contamination. The Koppenberg matched this profile perfectly. The radar detected anomalies consistent with disturbed earth, possible mass burial sites from the medieval period. But when excavation permits were requested, local authorities denied them. The official reason cited cultural sensitivity concerns. Unofficially, some researchers believe the town feared what confirmation might do to the legend that draws tourists by the thousands each year. More damning is what archaeologists have found in Hamelin's medieval cemeteries, or rather, what they have not found. Systematic surveys of burial grounds from the period between 1200 and 1300 show expected distributions of child remains for every decade except one. The decade of 1280 to 1290 shows a statistically significant absence of juvenile skeletons. Children's graves that should be there simply are not. The remains stop, then resume in the following decade. Some researchers argue this could indicate record-keeping failures or cemetery relocations, but others point out that adult burials from the same period are well documented and present. Only the children are missing. The dancing plague phenomenon offers a particularly disturbing possible mechanism for what might have happened. Between the 14th and 17th centuries, Europe experienced several outbreaks of dancing mania, where dozens or hundreds of people would dance uncontrollably for days or weeks until they collapsed from exhaustion. The most famous case occurred in Strasbourg in 1518, when around 400 people danced without rest, and several died from heart attacks, strokes, and sheer fatigue. But lesser-known incidents occurred earlier. Chronicles from Erfurt in 1237 described children dancing out of the town and not returning. A 1278 account from Utrecht mentions young people seized by uncontrollable movement. Modern medical researchers examining these accounts have identified ergot poisoning as a probable cause. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain, especially in damp, cool growing seasons. When consumed in bread made from infected grain, it causes convulsions, hallucinations, and a crawling sensation under the skin that can drive victims to tear off their clothes and run wildly through streets. Crucially, ergot affects children more severely than adults due to their lower body weight. In a town like Hamelin, where rye bread would have been a dietary staple, an ergot outbreak could have affected primarily the young. Victims often described feeling compelled to move, to dance, to follow invisible music. They spoke of seeing beautiful visions, of hearing songs that no one else could hear. In their altered state, children might have wandered away from the town, perhaps toward the river, perhaps into the woods. In their delirium, they might have seemed to follow someone or something visible only to them. The 1284 climate records from Northern Europe show an unusually wet spring and summer. Perfect conditions for ergot growth. Hamelin, situated along the Weser River, in a valley prone to morning mists and damp air, would have been especially vulnerable. If the town's rye harvest had been contaminated, and if the bread made from it had been consumed primarily by children, perhaps as part of a feast day celebration on the 26th of June, the results could have been catastrophic. But ergot poisoning alone does not explain mass death. Most victims recover once the contaminated food source is removed. Unless the children, in their hallucinatory state, met with some other disaster, unless they wandered to the river and drowned, unless they fled into the forest and succumbed to exposure, unless, in their convulsions and fever, they simply died, one after another, in a place where their parents could not reach them in time. The psychological dimensions of this theory cut deepest. Medieval parents faced child mortality rates that modern minds struggle to comprehend. But there is a vast difference between losing children one by one to the expected diseases of childhood and losing an entire generation in a single day. The first kind of grief had rituals, prayers, social structures to contain it. The second kind would have been annihilating. Communities create myths to survive trauma that exceeds their capacity to process. The myth of the Pied Piper transforms passive victims of disease into active participants in a story. Children do not die helpless in their beds or convulsing in the streets. Instead, they follow. They choose, in a way. They go somewhere. The Piper gives them agency. He gives their death direction, purpose, a destination. This psychological need explains why the legend insists the children are not dead, but simply gone. The mountain opens and swallows them. They travel to Transylvania. They emerge in a distant land. Any of these fates, however strange, is preferable to the truth of small bodies laid in unmarked graves, of parents who could not save them, of a community that simply had to continue living after burying its future. Consider how the story has been retold across centuries. The Piper becomes more colorful, more sinister, more clearly other. He is given motivations, a contract, a revenge plot. These additions make the story bearable by making it understandable. A broken promise, an unpaid debt. These are human failures with human consequences. They suggest that if the townspeople had simply paid the piper, the children would have been fine. This narrative sleight of hand transforms random tragedy into preventable disaster. It suggests control where none existed. It offers the comfort of blame. The alternative, that children died, for no reason, other than contaminated grain and bad luck, and the simple, brutal mathematics of medieval mortality, offers no such comfort. It provides no lesson to learn, no villain to hate, no wrong to right. It is simply loss, pure and complete. And human beings, then as now, will do almost anything to avoid facing that kind of meaningless void. Modern grief counselors recognize this impulse. Parents who lose children to sudden illness or accident often create elaborate narratives about their child's final moments, imagining peace or purpose where there may have been only confusion and pain. This is not delusion, but survival. The mind protects itself by crafting stories it can live with. Hamelin needed a story it could live with. And so the piper appeared, not in reality, but in collective memory. He gave shape to shapeless horror. He turned disease into abduction, random death into purposeful leaving. The children did not die. They went away. They might still be somewhere. The distinction seems small, but it is everything. Evidence continues to accumulate in fragments. Town ordinances from the early 1300s prohibit music and dancing on the street where the children were last seen. This restriction lasted for centuries, suggesting deep trauma associated with that location. Why ban music if the story is simply about an unpaid rat catcher? But if that street is where convulsing children gathered, where parents watched helpless as their sons and daughters danced themselves into fatal exhaustion, then the prohibition makes terrible sense. The truth may lie not in archives or archaeological digs, but in the persistent details the story cannot quite erase. The specificity of the date, the 26th of June. The insistence that it was children, not adults. The mountain that opened and closed, perhaps a metaphor for Earth accepting bodies. The silence that followed, a town that stopped singing because there were no children's voices to carry the songs forward. Hamelin today maintains museums dedicated to the legend, stages annual performances, sells piper-themed souvenirs. Tourists pose for photographs on the Bungelusenstrasse, the street without drums, where the children supposedly disappeared. They do not know they may be standing over graves. The town has chosen its version of events, and that version includes a magical piper and children who went somewhere rather than nowhere. But in the quiet of the town's oldest church, in the gaps in the burial records, in the absence where presence should be, another story whispers. It speaks of mass graves and ergot poisoning, of a community that lost its children in a single terrible day, and then spent centuries transforming that loss into legend. It suggests that the pied coat was fever's flush, the music was delirium's song, and the mountain that swallowed the children was simply Earth doing what Earth does, accepting the dead and keeping them. Perhaps that is the real horror. Not that the children were stolen, but that they were never stolen at all. They simply died, as children did in medieval Europe, in numbers too large to bear. And their parents, unable to carry that truth, gave them instead to a story where at least the children went dancing. A story where at least there was music. A story where at least someone, even a sinister piper, cared enough to lead them away. Anything at all, except the silence of empty rooms and the unbearable knowledge that no one was coming back. In the shadow of Hamelin's darkest hour, when 130 children vanished behind the mountain, 3 were left behind. This detail appears in several versions of the chronicle, though the reasons for its suppression become clearer the deeper we dig. 1 child was blind and could not follow where the others went. 1 was deaf and could not hear the music that called them. 1 was lame and could not keep pace with the dancing procession. These 3 remained when all the others had gone, and what they witnessed that day in 1284 would haunt Hamelin for centuries to come. The question that echoes through time is simple, yet terrifying. If these children survived to tell what happened, where is their testimony? Why do we only find fragments, whispers, carefully worded warnings in the margins of medieval manuscripts? The answer may lie not in what was forgotten, but in what was deliberately erased. The blind child's account, according to a commentary found in the margins of a 14th century manuscript held in the archives of Brunswick, spoke of sounds that no music could make. The child described the piper's melody as something that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, a sound that made the very stones of Hamelin vibrate with an unholy frequency. But it was what came after the music stopped that proved most disturbing. The blind child spoke of silence so profound it felt like being buried alive, followed by a sound like the mountain itself opening its throat to swallow. Then screaming. Not the screams of frightened children, but screams of something else entirely. Screams that the child insisted were not screams of fear, but of transformation. The manuscript containing this reference was later damaged in a fire at the monastery where it was kept. Only the marginal notes survived, and even these were deemed too dangerous to preserve in their complete form. A later monk had scratched out entire passages, leaving only fragments visible under certain lighting conditions. Modern scholars, who have examined the document, report feeling inexplicably uneasy in its presence, though they attribute this to suggestion rather than any supernatural cause. The deaf child's testimony survives in even more fragmentary form, preserved in a letter written by a priest to his bishop in 1302. The child, now grown, had apparently sought confession, but found the experience so traumatic that it had to be discontinued. According to the priest's letter, the survivor described watching the other children follow the piper through the streets of Hamelin in a state that resembled sleepwalking. Their eyes were open but unseeing, their mouths moving as though singing along with a song only they could hear. The deaf child ran alongside them, pulling at their clothes, shaking them, screaming their names. None responded. None even seemed to notice. But it was what the deaf witness saw at Koppelberg Hill that the priest found most disturbing. The letter describes how the child watched as the mountain itself seemed to shimmer and shift, as though it were not made of solid stone at all, but of something that could be parted like a curtain. The piper walked directly toward the rock face, and the stone opened before him. Not like a door or a cave, the priest emphasized in his letter, but as though the mountain were made of water and simply flowed apart. The children walked through, still in their trance, still singing their silent song. And then, just before the mountain closed again, the deaf child saw them turn around. All of them, in perfect unison. And they looked back at Hamelin with eyes that were no longer the eyes of children. The priest's letter ends abruptly. There is no record of any response from the bishop, and the priest himself died within the year under circumstances the parish records describe only as unfortunate and strange. The letter was found sealed in a lead box, along with instructions that it should never be opened. Those instructions were ignored in 1768 by an antiquarian who subsequently burned the letter, though not before making a partial copy. That copy circulated among collectors of occult manuscripts before being acquired by a private library in Bavaria, where it remains to this day, available to researchers only under strict supervision. The lame child's account is perhaps the most disturbing of all, precisely because it was the most detailed. This child, unable to keep up with the dancing procession, followed at a distance, struggling along the cobblestones with a crutch. By the time the child reached Koppelberg Hill, the other children were already disappearing into the mountain. But the lame witness arrived in time to see something the others had not. As the last of the children entered the mountain, the piper paused at the threshold. He turned and looked back at Hamelin, and the lame child saw his face clearly for the first time. The description of that face appears in multiple sources, always phrased carefully, always incomplete. The creature that wore the piper's colorful clothes had features that were almost human, but arranged in a way that suggested something older, something that understood human appearance but could not quite replicate it convincingly. Then the piper smiled, and the lame child saw that his teeth were not teeth at all, but something else. The descriptions vary. Some say they were like stones. Others say they were like seeds. One particularly disturbing account suggests they were like the milk teeth of every child who had ever gone missing in the Weser Valley, somehow harvested and set into the piper's gums like a grotesque collection. But what happened next is what sealed the lame child's fate and perhaps explains why these testimonies were suppressed. According to the most complete version of the story, preserved in a dialect poem from the early 1600s, the piper spoke to the remaining child. He said that the mountain had been fed and would sleep for another 100 years. He said that the children had paid a debt that Hamelin's elders had made and refused to honor. And then he said something that appears in every version of the story that mentions it, always in the same words. He said, "Tell them what you saw, and they will call you mad. Show them where we went, and the mountain will take you too. Keep silent, and you may live, but you will never sleep soundly again." The lame child took the third option that the piper had not mentioned. The child spoke, but spoke carefully, revealing only parts of the truth, changing details, obscuring the most horrific elements. And even this partial testimony was too much for Hamelin to bear. Within a generation, the survivor's account was being actively suppressed by town authorities. References to the witness were struck from official records. The family name disappeared from tax rolls and property deeds. It was as though the town had decided that the only way to live with what had happened was to erase even the evidence that anyone had survived to tell the tale. Medieval scholars have noted references in various manuscripts to children who came back changed or who spoke of the mountain. A chronicle from Westphalia mentions a child in Hamelin who would wake screaming about music that played backwards, about a hill that was hollow, about a place beneath the earth where children danced in circles that had no end. The chronicle notes that this child was eventually confined to a monastery, where monks were instructed to pray for the child's soul and to prevent the child from speaking to anyone from outside the cloister. The child died young, the chronicle reports, and was buried in unconsecrated ground at a crossroads, with a stone placed over the grave to keep something from getting out, or perhaps to keep something from getting in. Koppelberg Hill itself has been investigated numerous times over the centuries. Modern geological surveys reveal nothing unusual about its composition. It is limestone and shale, unremarkable in every measurable way. Yet local residents still report feeling uncomfortable near the hill, particularly on the 26th of June, the anniversary of the children's disappearance. Some claim to hear music coming from inside the mountain on that day, though no source can ever be found. Others report seeing children's footprints in the soil around the hill's base, footprints that appear overnight and disappear by noon, dissolving as though they were never there at all. Calvary Hill, sometimes confused with Koppelberg in later retellings, adds another layer to the mystery. Some versions of the story place the disappearance here instead, and the name itself carries weight. Calvary, the place of skulls, the place of sacrifice. Was the confusion intentional, or did some medieval chronicler understand something about the true nature of what happened that day? A sacrifice requires a debt, and the piper's words to the lame child speak clearly of payment for obligations unfulfilled. The curse placed on anyone who speaks the full truth of what happened appears in multiple sources, though the exact nature of the curse varies. Some versions say that anyone who tells the complete story will lose their own children within the year. Others claim that the teller will be drawn to Koppelberg Hill on the next anniversary of the disappearance, and will walk into the mountain, never to return. The most disturbing version suggests that telling the full truth summons the piper back, and that he always collects what he is owed, with interest calculated across the centuries of silence. This may explain why every complete account we have is fragmentary, why every witness who tried to tell the whole story either recanted, disappeared, or died under mysterious circumstances. The truth of what happened to the children of Hamelin may still exist, scattered across a dozen manuscripts, hidden in margins and footnotes, encrypted in poems and songs, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to piece it all together. The three survivors, if they truly existed, took their full knowledge to the grave, but they left traces, breadcrumbs for those who dare to follow. In their fragmented testimonies, we glimpse something that medieval chroniclers found too terrible to record in clear language. We see the suggestion of a world beneath our own, of entities that can take human form but remain fundamentally alien, of debts that must be paid in the currency that such beings value most: the innocent, the uncorrupted, the young. What did those three children actually see? Perhaps they saw the true face of the piper, the thing behind the mask of medieval clothing and charming melodies. Perhaps they saw where the mountain led, that hollow place where 130 children went and from which none returned. Perhaps they saw the children transform into something else, something that could live in that dark kingdom beneath the hill. Or perhaps they simply saw the truth that Hamelin could not face, that the town's greed and broken promises had opened a door that should have remained forever closed, and that the price for closing it again was measured in lives too young to understand what was being asked of them. The testimony was lost, or it was hidden, or it was destroyed, but the fear remains, encoded in the warning that still echoes through Hamelin's streets. Do not play music on Bungelissenstrasse, the street where no drums may sound. Do not speak of the children who went into the mountain. And above all, do not seek the complete truth of what happened on that June day in 1284, because some knowledge carries a price that even 700 years of distance cannot diminish. The three witnesses saw something that could not be unseen, spoke words that could not be unspoken, and carried a burden that could not be shared. Their silence, enforced by curse or common sense, protected Hamelin from a truth too terrible to bear. But silence has a weight of its own, and unanswered questions have a way of growing heavier with time. Somewhere in the archives, in the margins, in the spaces between official history and whispered folklore, the full story still waits. And the mountain, patient and hollow, waits too. 740 years. That is how long humanity has been trying to solve what happened in Hamelin. 7 centuries of investigation, speculation, and research by historians, folklorists, genealogists, and amateur detectives. Countless hours spent poring over medieval documents, tracing migration patterns, analyzing linguistic drift in old German dialects, and yet we stand today no closer to certainty than the traumatized parents who watched their children vanish on that June day in 1284. The evidence itself refuses to cooperate with any single explanation. Consider the precision of that number. 130 children died out. Not approximately 130. Not many children, or most of the children. Exactly 130. Medieval record-keeping was notoriously imprecise about such things. Plagues were described as killing many, or most. Famines affected numerous families. But Hamelin's town chronicles specify 130 with the exactitude of a census. Why? If this were merely legend growing in the telling, we would expect the number to vary across sources, to balloon with each retelling as folklore tends to do. Instead, it remains stubbornly, impossibly consistent. And then there is the matter of age. Every account agrees the children taken were of a specific age range, old enough to walk on their own but young enough to still be called children. Infants were not taken. Teenagers were not taken. This selectivity haunts every theory we construct. A plague does not discriminate by such narrow age brackets. Economic migration would include whole families, or at least some adults. Military conscription in that era took young men, not children. A crusade would have been led by adults. The precision of this selection suggests intention, planning, something deliberate that none of our neat historical explanations can fully accommodate. The town itself recorded this event with solemnity that transcends myth. The inscription in the town records does not read like legend. It reads like testimony, like the careful documentation of bureaucrats recording something too important to risk forgetting. In the year of our Lord 1284, on the day of Saints John and Paul, 130 children born in Hamelin were led out of the town by a piper wearing multicolored clothes. They were lost at the place of execution near the hills. This is not the language of fairy tale. This is the language of official record, stark and specific and terrible in its brevity. And what of the stained glass window? The one piece of contemporary evidence that might have shown us exactly how the people of 1284 understood what happened to them, destroyed centuries ago. We have only descriptions of descriptions, accounts written by people who saw the window before it was lost. They mention the piper, the children, the clothing details, but what else was depicted there? What context, what surrounding imagery, what Latin inscription might have clarified everything? That window was installed in the church not as decoration but as memorial, as witness, and we have lost it forever. We are left interpreting shadows of shadows, trying to reconstruct truth from fragments of fragments. Walk down Bungelissenstrasse today, the street where no music plays. This is not tourist folklore invented last century for atmosphere. Records show this prohibition has existed for hundreds of years. Locals still observe it. Even now, even among young people who roll their eyes at superstition, there remains an unspoken agreement that this street deserves silence. Tour guides lower their voices when they pass through. Street musicians who perform throughout Hamelin avoid this single block. Why does a practical modern town maintain such a ritual, if there is nothing at its heart but fairy tale? And tourists report something else. They speak of it in online forums, in travel blogs, in hushed conversations afterward. An overwhelming sadness that descends without warning as they stand on that cobblestone street. A feeling of loss, so profound, it brings some to tears. They describe it as grief that is not their own, as if the stones themselves remember. Skeptics dismiss this as suggestion, as people feeling what they expect to feel in a place marketed as mysterious. But the reports come too frequently, too consistently, from too many people who arrived knowing nothing of what to expect. The town's insistence adds another layer to the mystery. Hamelin has had centuries to dismiss this as legend, to quietly let it fade into quaint folklore requiring no actual belief. Tourism would function just as well with a wink and a nudge, an acknowledgement that this is simply a charming old story. Instead, the town treats it as historical fact. The city archives maintain it among verified events. Local historians speak of it not as myth, but as the defining tragedy of their city's past. This collective certainty, passed down through generations, suggests an original event so undeniable that no amount of time could erode the knowledge that something real and terrible happened. Every theory we construct collapses under the weight of details it cannot explain. The Children's Crusade explanation fails the date, fails the age range, fails the specificity. The migration theory cannot account for why only children would go, why the town would record it as tragedy rather than opportunity, why parents would not follow or retrieve them. The plague theory stumbles over the precision of the number and the absence of mass graves within the town. The dancing plague suggestion ignores that such outbreaks were documented with clear medical language when they occurred elsewhere. The economic conscription idea cannot explain the piper, the specific date, the memorial window, the street where music dare not play. Perhaps the answer lies waiting in an unmarked mass grave somewhere between Hamelin and the eastern frontier. Perhaps in some village in Poland or Moravia, genealogical records hold surnames that would trace back to Hamelin families of 1284. Perhaps in an archive we have not yet searched, a letter or chronicle makes passing mention of 130 German children arriving unexpectedly, explaining where they came from and why. The truth might be one document away, one archaeological discovery away, one DNA analysis away from revelation. Or perhaps the horror is more complete than we imagine. Perhaps we do not know what happened because the event was designed to leave no trace, because whatever took those children was thorough enough to erase not just their lives, but their very destination from history. In a world where we can trace trade routes from the Bronze Age, decode languages dead for millennia, and reconstruct battles from fragments of armor, the absolute disappearance of 130 children feels almost impossible, almost supernatural in its completeness. Consider the truly chilling possibility that in a world increasingly documented, where medieval tax records and merchant ledgers survive to tell us who bought what grain in what year, some events are so absolute in their horror that they erase themselves. That the children of Hamelin walked into a darkness so complete it swallowed not just their futures but any evidence of their fate. That their footsteps lead into nowhere, because nowhere is precisely where they went, to a place or circumstance that left nothing behind but the echo of their absence. 740 years of questions, 740 years of silence from the stones of Bungelosenstrasse. And still, on summer days when tourists crowd the square, if you stand very quiet on that musicless street, some claim you can almost hear it. The sound of children's feet on cobblestones, marching in time to a tune no one living has ever heard, walking toward an answer that remains, after all this time, just beyond our reach. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.